Good morning. Good morning, all. We're going to start. I think maybe one or two people might roll in still, but it's 9 o'clock, so here we go. My name's Lewis Blackwell. I'm the chair of today's session. I'm the Director of Strategy and Development here at the Building Centre. I work for the Built Environment Trust, which operates the whole Building Centre. And we've been behind the Wellbeing programme that you may have been connected with, the Making Wellbeing exhibition that was running at the end of the year and the beginning of the year upstairs. And all the talks. This is the last but one in the series of wellbeing talks that we've been doing around that exhibition. Although, of course, wellbeing will continue to be very much part of the theme of things we care about here. I've got a call out for that the last but one, because there's one more event next week, March the 1st, Thursday. Our last event is a good one. It's what's the title of it? Well, it's about Storstrom Prison, which you may think, why Storstrom Prison? Storstrom Prison is supposed to be the most humane prison in the world, built in near Copenhagen. And we have the architects, C.F. Muller, and we have the landscape architect as well, coming over to talk about what they did there. And we have somebody from the Prison Reform Trust discussing this with them about the different approach, how buildings and environments kind of shape behaviours. And in the case of Denmark versus the UK, recidivism is half the level, so it's a very good investment. We don't seem to want to make that investment here, but it's a very interesting prison, very kind of world-leading project. So if you want to come to that, it's next Thursday in the evening, that one. But to today, I think about well-being and this sort of the developing agenda we have around it is it's all very well to talk about it, and there's lots of bits to it, but how do you really get it into the thinking? How do you get it into planning, right through to development, through to how we run things, that it's actually sort of in the water, as it were, in the DNA of things? And this session today is taking a look at that, really, with our three speakers. One coming from a planning perspective, right through to a developer's perspective, and a kind of consultant perspective as well, really helping us understand where we are today and where we maybe need to go in the direction of travel. So we have three speakers. They will speak, and then we'll take all the questions at the end, if that's okay with you. And we hope to have you out of here by 10:15 at the latest. So it's very much an early morning briefing. First up, Amber Morley. Amber's speaking on her own. I know it says Amy's going to be speaking, but unfortunately, Amy, her well-being is not so good today. She has a back problem and won't be able to join us. But Amber will absolutely give the whole of the presentation. Amber is a consultant of Turley Economics, and they provide a range of economic and social impact research for the planning sector, including specialist advice on health impact assessment and environmental impact assessments. So Amber has supported many different kinds of clients, helping them understand how negative social infrastructural issues, how those impacts can be best mitigated. Her work is informed in part by her own MSc studies in spatial planning done at UCL just up the road. And she's pursued a specialism there in sustainability. So Amber's going to be first up, and I just realised I haven't done a little bit of housekeeping. So of course, turn your phones off, or turn them to silent. You can do tweets and things if you like, but please have those phones off. We are videoing today as well, so when we do the questions at the end, please wait for the mic, and if you don't want to be in the video, hide your face. Anyway, okay, so over to Amber. Thank you very much, and first up.
Thank you very much. Right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming along today. Last week, 30 mayors met in Copenhagen for the European Healthy Cities Summit. It's really interesting. This is the first time that a summit of this size has taken place within Europe. Health is becoming a political choice for many countries within Europe and indeed around the world. We're following this agenda particularly closely at Turley. My role, as Lewis said, at Turley is in the economics team, and we provide economic and social research to inform the land and property sector within the UK. That's my first slide. As part of this team, I lead and help support Amy with the health impact assessment work, where we advise clients about health infrastructure implications of their development, as well as understanding about what the health impacts are on the local community. My role also extends into the academic world, and I'm studying part-time for an MSc in spatial planning at UCL, where, as Lewis mentioned, my specialism is in sustainability. And I'm particularly interested in looking at how experts work together and how policy becomes integrated within planning. The presentation that I'll be giving today draws on the health impact assessment experience that we've developed as a team at Turley. And I'll be establishing the policy context behind what's going on at the moment with the health and wellbeing agenda. After this, I'll be giving 3 recommendations as to what we think needs to happen in terms of better integrating health within the planning process. As I go through this presentation, I'd ask you to have reflect on a recent project that you've worked on, private or public sector, and ask you to consider and challenge yourself as to whether this went far enough to help the local community's health and wellbeing. Defining health and wellbeing is a really important place to start in this presentation, as so often how we define the problem can shape how we think about the solution to some of these topics in the agenda. Health is traditionally thought in quite simple terms, in terms of we can think about it in our proximity to GP services or our access to primary health care. But this discourse within public health has really changed over the last 20 years. And now we think about health as being governed by a range of economic, social, and environmental conditions. The Marmot Review, published by UCL, showed us that a range of conditions can govern how our individual well-being is impacted, from cycle infrastructure to larger global food systems to environmental factors, and of course the built environment. And within this, planning sits within this topic. And this will be the focus of the presentation today. Of course, planning has its roots within public health, and as planners, we're often really proud of that heritage. And public health provides a foundational principle for some of these ideas that we think about today. This is an example of Eldon Court within Liverpool, which was one of the first social housing projects within the UK. And this particular development was a response to some of the really poor housing conditions which were existing within the city. Another example is the Boundary Estate within London, now in the popular area of Shoreditch. Again, this was a physical response to some of the issues that were happening in the city, and planners sort of took it on themselves to be able to actively manage the space in the interests of public health. Skipping on until now, public health is now back on the agenda in terms of international policy. The UN, as I mentioned earlier, last year, the new urban agenda, which was launched at Quito, identified health as being the pulse of this new agenda. The World Health Organization has also been a keen advocate of health and well-being and really exploring this link between cities and health. Again, the WHO European Healthy City Summit is a really key example of this. But how is health being governed on a national level? Particularly interestingly, in the UK case, the Health and Social Care Act in 2012 was a really important instance within public health legislation. As a result of this act, the responsibility of public health was moved down into the local authority. And of course, this is where planning activity happens. So in terms of a governance structure, these two elements started to become more linked. Well, often and unfortunately it can be criticised that this hasn't gone far enough, but this gives an example of some of the flavours of the debate that are happening at the moment. But what about the tangible impacts on planning policy? The NHS Healthy New Towns initiative is one example of how health and well-being is being used as a planning principle in today's planning policy. This is an example of Barking Riverside, where they're using these 10 Healthy New Town principles to guide the Section 106 contributions. Within local plan policy, we are now seeing specific policies which control how many hot food takeaways are near schools, for example. And of course, the London Plan now puts the healthy streets approach right at its core of what it's delivering. And this is something Gavin will be speaking on later. The more technical side of planning involves undertaking environmental impact assessments as part of the process. And again, a really key thing that happened last year was that the regulations changed as a result of changing EU law, which put human health considerations within the balance of all the different factors that we have to consider. Again, it will be interesting to see how this is adopted within development and whether human health is always given the weight that it should be. So far, we have a pretty good evidence base and understanding that health and well-being is linked somehow to the built environment, and interventions in the physical space of the city does have important health and well-being outcomes. There's momentum within the policy, which is built on historical roots, and we're now seeing this having tangible impacts within planning policy. But what are the barriers to developing some of these aspects of the agenda? I'm going to take you through 3 recommendations which we think which reflect some of our experience of undertaking health impact assessments. My first ingredient for integrating health within the planning policy, which I think is particularly important, is developing local intelligence about the area in which you're working in. Consultant teams that are well informed about the local health issues and about the local health issues in the area will often make better recommendations which are relevant to the people living nearby. A robust baseline leads to smart and relevant recommendations for this particular area. And maps such as this and data can be used intelligently to help tailor the development to meet these needs. But intelligence isn't just about data. Intelligence is also about local expertise that exists within the local authorities and the local people living nearby. Tapping into these streams of knowledge is a really important part of any development process, whether it's the public health officer within the council or really listening to the people as part of public consultations exercise is a really key way to feed in the particular intelligence into your project. And a particular example we've worked on recently was for a health impact assessment for the Camden Goods Yard scheme within London Borough of Camden. This is a large mixed-use development where we worked on behalf of Barratt London. In undertaking the health impact assessment, we liaise with the public health officer within the borough, and they provide some really key insights into the issues which existed locally. Mental health was established as being one particular concern for the borough, and there were some recommendations made about using the public realm around the different sites which were being built in order to facilitate greater social interaction between people living on the site. We were able to take these recommendations and pass them on to the landscape architect as part of the team, and the planning team at Turley were really important in facilitating that connection. The second recommendation, which I say was another key enabler for integrating health within planning, is collaboration within the project team. Health is a multidisciplinary problem and therefore requires a multidisciplinary solution. The good news is that often this expertise already exists within the project team, from the air quality consultant, to the noise consultant, to the human health assessor, to the flood risk consultant, often this expertise already exists and is supporting the client. While there are often challenges as to how to get different knowledges and expertise to work together, which has been well documented within academic literature, there are different ways that you can try and facilitate this type of collaboration. Is it as simple as sending around a list of everyone's contact details at the beginning of the project? Is it about setting up a startup meeting at the beginning? Or is it more radical and trying to set up a human health steering group throughout the project? These particular elements, such as team culture, are really important, as I said, enabler to help this type of integration. So, again, we have our evidence base. We understand that health and well-being is a good thing to consider when we're planning our project. We know what types of interventions might work. Do we want to put a cycleway in, provide extra cycle storage? And our team is working really well together and working quite collaboratively. But when it actually comes down to delivering what's needed on site, we come against a lot of different barriers, such as viability, heritage assets being located nearby. It's really important to consider there's not one silver bullet solution that's going to make our development nice and healthy. There's some really difficult trade-offs that planners often have to make when they're considering these types of schemes. And that's an important thing to be upfront about when we're talking about the health and well-being agenda. For example, do you invest more into public realm to facilitate greater social interaction between residents? Or should you be providing that extra couple of social houses? One of the calls in this presentation is that I think we need more evaluative research in order to understand what the true impact of our decisions are and help us to weigh up different options on the scheme in terms of understanding what the health and well-being outcomes are. One particular tool that can be used is understanding the social value. Social value is a methodology which is really interesting and growing at the moment, where you assign a financial proxy to different options. So you start to understand potentially what the outcomes of different decisions are. Although that can be difficult and often problematic, potentially it's a way of understanding what the impact of these decisions are. So this presentation has charted the evolution of how health is being considered in planning, all being quite a brief history that I've given, from the very foundations of public health being used as a justification for providing social housing in new industrialised cities, to how this agenda is being adopted within international policy now. We all know that health is a really good thing to consider, but being upfront about the challenges that we're facing in the built environment sector is really important to acknowledge. So how do we try our best to try and make health remain a priority within these types of decisions? I've provided 3 examples from my own experience: promoting intelligence, facilitating effective collaboration, and really investing in the research into what options are going to work for a particular site. Moving the debate from policy into action, I think, is a really key next step for our industry. But also that throws up some really difficult questions about responsibility and how we incentivise this type of movement. At the beginning of the presentation, I asked you to think and asked you to challenge yourself about a recent project that you've worked on. And I wonder whether your suggestions would be the same as mine. Anyway, Turley are pretty excited about this agenda, and I've got a particular passion for it, studying it within my master's. So it'd be interesting to answer your questions later in the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amber. I think You're certainly getting into an interesting space there, talking about the social value tool. I think we'll come back onto that in the questions. Well, I will anyway. So our next speaker is Gavin McLaughlin, and Gavin is currently TfL Spatial Planning's lead officer for new developments in Camden, Islington, Hackney and the City of London. And he's responsible for updating TfL's transport assessment guidance to support the new London plan. He's worked with a number of public and private sector stakeholders in his previous roles as well. So I think he's got a nice broad perspective to bring to this topic. And over to you, Gavin.
So yes, I'm Gavin McLaughlin from Transport for London. Not a fully qualified town planner, despite 2 master's degrees since my geography undergraduate degree, but an experienced practitioner, and I used to be involved with Urban Design London. Some of you have perhaps attended some of those events. Similarly, very excited about this new public health agenda, which is receiving more attention in planning. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is how the new TfL Healthy Streets agenda relates to the new Mayor's Transport Strategy, and how we're going to start embedding healthy streets in TfL's work and some of the work of the GLA family. We're from a family, which we're in with the GLA, through the draft London plan. Then finally, I'm going to touch on our evolving expectations of developers, because my bread and butter is negotiating with property developers to encourage them to make design changes or provide public contributions to support walking, cycling, public transport, and in a distant fourth, the road network. So yeah, first of all, there are 3 new major policy pieces, which I'm sure you're aware of. The Mayor's Transport Strategy, a strategic vision with targets for transport within London. Healthy Streets, which is an approach I will explain in a bit more detail later. And the London Plan. I'm sure some of you have seen the consultation, maybe got your comments in. We encourage you to engage with that consultation process as Londoners, as professionals in the built environment sector. So, by 2041, our aim as part of the Mayor's Transport Strategy, our headline target, really our key target, is for 80% of Londoners' trips to be on foot, by cycle or using public transport. That's personal trips. And if you see where we're at the moment, we're on, excuse my poor maths, 64%. So we're looking to get quite a boost. This would make London one of the most sustainable cities for transport compared to its density. I'm not quite sure when we'd match Copenhagen. Sounds like Copenhagen's the place to be. They've got the best prison. They're getting the mayors together to talk about these kind of things. But yeah, so why are we writing the Mayor's Transport Strategy and changing our methodologies and tackling these issues? It's because London is set to grow. By 2041, there'll be 1 million additional daytime journeys in and out of what we call the Central Activities Zone, to and from central London. And there'll be a 60% increase in crowding on the Underground by 2041, something to look forward to. And a 150% increase in crowding on national rail services. So we're firefighting as a strategic transport authority on a decade by decade, mayoral term by mayoral term basis. That's all due to population growth, which is great. It's great, the attractiveness of London, the dynamism of London. So we want to respond to that positively by increasing our focus on walking and cycling. I mentioned that feeding the Central Activities Zone is quite critical to London's economy. And, you know, by 2041, our analysis shows that demand will outstrip supply, and potentially limiting the growth of jobs and the generation of economic growth in central London that we rely on to be a world-class global capital for the Mayor and all of you guys. So yeah, our response to that is the Healthy Streets approach, pretty much. That's what we're going to be pushing forward with, and that's what links us into this event today. So the Healthy Streets approach was developed by a colleague of mine, Lucy Saunders, and we expect the Healthy Streets approach to be delivered across the GLA family. You can have a read of that diagram by yourselves. It's going to ensure that transport decisions prioritise human health and quality of life. And our MTS is the first transport strategy anywhere in the world to apply this Healthy Streets approach to the entire transport system of a capital city. So we're going to use the approach to create a city that's not dominated by traffic. And our focus on healthy streets as physical spaces is actually multimodal. It applies to every type of journey you can make, because every type of journey you make starts or ends on a street. You know, you're getting out of that car, you're getting off that bus, coming out of that tube station. So this is my favourite slide. My personal notes here say your favourite slide. The reason it's my favourite slide is it's my favourite target, the only one as important as our 80% target in the MTS, which is that by 2041, have I got that? Yeah, brilliant. All Londoners do at least 20 minutes of active travel, which they need to stay healthy each day. And also, down here, some of you might not be able to see it, E, that's the bottom right for the people looking on the other side. It says in the MTS that TfL's role is going to be ensuring any scheme being undertaken on London streets for any reason improves conditions for walking and cycling. So we're being ambitious. The reasons that we're being ambitious are most Londoners don't get enough activity to stay healthy, according to public health professionals and medical professionals. And if everyone walked or cycled for 20 minutes each day, we could save the NHS 1.7 billion in treatment costs. We're linking that to streets, as I said, because you know streets make up 80% of the city's public spaces. It's not piazzas, you know, it's streets. And so we want London streets to be places for cars, not people. The other way around. I was just testing you. Places for people, not cars. Yeah. So hopefully you guys understand what we're aiming for as an organisation. We're using the Healthy Streets approach to promote people on streets rather than or as well as cars. And we're doing that for public health reasons. And through the London plan, we will, you know, get a bit more serious with developers about implementing this. There are two things from the overarching objectives in the plan that I'd like to highlight, which is that if you look at point 2, making the best use of land, you know, we've got another mayor who's committed to protect the green belt and metropolitan open space, which naturally shifts focus for new housing to sites around stations and within town centres, to urban sites. So we think that that's good for the Healthy Streets agenda because it puts people near things they can walk and cycle to. And I'd also just like to emphasise point 4, which is that we still need 66,000 homes a year up to 2041. And so we're going to see a greater emphasis on outer London. And obviously we want 50% of those homes to be affordable. So that background context hasn't disappeared. We're going to focus growth along transport corridors. And a critical change, I think, is we're going to encourage more planning permissions which are contingent on the provision of new and necessary public transport or active travel infrastructure. So that means Grampian conditions, it means negative conditions. It means us saying we would support growth here if you provided these improvements. And, you know, the plan continues to put big ticket infrastructure projects at its heart. You can see a few listed there, the Bakerloo line extension, Crossrail 2. It continues to recognise the importance of walking, cycling and public transport to unlocking new development, but there's some slight changes to that which I'll explain to you later on. Parking, is anybody really interested in parking? Show of hands. And if it's all right, I'll give you the slides afterwards, because I don't want to take questions on this. I didn't write the policy, and as policies go, it's one of the most rigid. So I'd be more than happy to discuss it with you afterwards, but I'm not 100% sure it's you know, a key thing for the wellbeing agenda. I'll state broadly that we're going to limit parking even further in an aggressive way, car parking, and we're going to promote cycle parking. And then I'm happy to share slides with you afterwards. I've even got 3 hidden slides, which go into real serious detail on it. But yeah, so what I'd like to focus a bit more on is our evolving expectations of developers, aside from severely limited car parking and significantly increased cycle parking. So really, you know, our new plan promotes a design-led approach to development, optimising land use and densities around town centres. It's removed the housing density matrix, and there's an emphasis on absorbing additional trips through active travel. So you can expect the GLA family, me and my GLA colleagues, to support higher densities where walking and cycling are maximised through high-quality urban design, basically. And that's because there's 2.4 million trips in London, which could be walked in full, but currently aren't. And then there's 1.2 million what we call linked trips, so trips that are part of a staged journey, which could be walked but aren't. So we're looking for new developments and new occupants of developments to make a contribution to our strategic ambitions around those potentially walkable trips. You know, so all of the design-related policies on public realm and transport are based on the Healthy Streets approach. And, you know, it's not a matter of choice once the new London plan comes in. Local planning policy and development proposals will have to demonstrate how they have applied and fit in with the Healthy Streets approach. So that will theoretically, in this wonderful future world we're all working towards, you know, mean that all development supports the 80% mode share target I mentioned at the beginning. All development will make the most efficient use of land, and that means encouraging space-efficient active travel modes. The easiest way of explaining that is to compare how many bikes you can fit in a parking space for a car, and to think about how many people fit on a bus and how much road space a bus takes up, you know. And there's some wonderful posters in the Transport Museum, which people that work at TfL spend their weekends looking at. So yeah, we want patterns of land use that facilitate residents making shorter, regular trips by walking or cycling. And then we also need to continue a focus on freight to limit private trips relating to goods. So I've told you that, you know, we want healthy streets. We're applying a healthy streets approach. It was stated at the very beginning of the mayoral term, and so it involves reducing traffic, pollution and noise, creating more attractive, accessible and people-friendly streets where everybody can enjoy spending time, being physically active and ultimately improving their health. So we want master plans to create walkable and cyclable environments that support car-free lifestyles. If you're working at a wider scale, at a master plan scale, you need to be looking at what in the local area people can walk and cycle to, not just telling us that the footways are paved with something really smooth, you know. So this is going to require a much sharper and stronger urban design focus, and that's what I'm going to start expecting from the likes of you. We're hoping to abandon a nil detriment approach to our discussions with developers. You know, I'm personally sick of talking about how nothing's going to get any worse. I want to talk about how things are going to get better for people's health, and ideally through them being more physically active and leading ideally completely car-free lifestyles, getting on foot, getting on bike. And, you know, that's complicated. So we're embracing this complexity within TfL, and this is the second time I've shown you this diagram, but it comes with lots of extra arrows because you can't do one of these things without the others. And there is no such thing as a healthy street. We see applying the healthy streets approach as really facing up to the trade-offs between these indicators and making them a part of how you work, how you design places. So we're going to publish some new guidance on how you can do that in mid-June, which is going to be new transport assessment guidance at the TfL website. And we're retraining our own officers to embrace this complexity. So, for example, all of our internal urban design consultations are now face-to-face with drawings rather than by email. And we are going through a huge program of internal training to teach our own officers about this approach and to promote it. There's a few resources already available to you. I'm nearly finished, by the way. Hope I'm doing okay for time. There's a few new resources available to you already. A guide to the Healthy Streets indicators. And up here on the right, we have the Healthy Streets Check for Designers. Now, that's quite a complicated spreadsheet analysis tool, which enables you to give yourself a score for a bit of public realm, a stretch of street, against each of those indicators. So you could apply it before and after a design intervention that's part of a new development. We're currently anticipating applying it to any Section 278 scheme with a value of above £200,000, and we expect to announce that formally in the summer. And we are also applying it to all of our own schemes. So, you know, we've got 3 key offers to you, basically over the next year and a half, which we'll make more formally in guidance and announcements. You know, we want to help you guys show clients and colleagues how critical transport and sustainable and active travel are to the future of London and its built environment. We want to try and expect the same Healthy Streets approach from you that we apply to ourselves, hence the release of a complicated technical spreadsheet analysis tool for you all to play with. And we're going to be looking to support density and growth through the planning process at new developments where the Healthy Streets approach is genuinely applied and prioritised. Just a final quick word on the new TA guidance, you know, which will summarise how we expect planning applicants to show us they have thought about public transport and active travel. And to my mind, this new Healthy Streets approach requires you to consider a site that you're working on at 3 different scales. The first is the network level, demonstrated by this crowding map. The red is the worst. I'm sure some of you are on those lines, and I told you earlier it's going to get even worse. But we will not abandon our focus on capacity, connectivity, and safeguarding. We're not going to stop assessing how many bus services and underground services will be available to the first people to move into or work in your new development on day one. We're not going to stop asking for large contributions if you want to build large-scale developments in poorly connected areas. So we will retain that scale, and that's still critical to the Healthy Streets approach, the network scale, a London-wide level. But then we need to see the neighbourhood receiving a bit more attention. And I love these isochrones and these shading maps. It's very, very common in Holland and Denmark to look at residential neighbourhoods and areas of new activity and urban development that spring up around stations based on what you can walk to within a reasonable amount of time and what you can cycle to within a reasonable amount of time. And these types of diagrams are not typically submitted with every major planning application at the moment, which is a disgrace. So finally, the front door. I call this scale the front door. What I'm talking about is, you know, just outside and within your red line, at your red line, yeah, potentially your Section 278 agreement with my colleagues about repaving this once you've driven 400 construction trucks over it, stuff like that. So those are the three scales, really, that I would say we're going to expect planning applicants and people building things in London to think about. The network scale, the neighbourhood scale, and the front door, your responsibility to your immediate surroundings. We're also extremely focused on construction logistics because it provides us with a massive headache during your actual builds. And we need to let you know that we have published some new guidance which applies to all referable planning applications in London and is not being widely picked up yet by boroughs, but needs to be. So please be aware of that and check it out. We're also doing a huge amount of engagement with construction contractors to get them to contribute to keeping some semblance of healthy streets while we do things which are very disruptive during the build of developments. So yeah, finally, I'd like to say I'm contactable. I'm contactable about the bigger picture with TfL and property developments, not just the boroughs I work in. We're targeting a online publication of new guidance which will tackle the issues I've discussed today in mid-June. My assistant planner Duncan here is going to be organising a little launch event that we can invite some of you to. And we will then start doing many more similar talks to this with a bit more detail across London in boroughs at any similar events which you'd like to invite us to. Because we very much see it as something we need to implement in partnership with all disciplines, surveyors, architects, property developers, everyone. So yeah, thanks a lot for having me. That's all.
Thank you very much, Gavin. Well, I think the next speaker is the perfect follow-up, as it were. How does all that really feel when you're on the developer end of it? And in James Pargeter, we have the ideal man because I think Greystar is a really interesting developer working on some major projects, taking a lot of fresh approach to things. But clearly, there's a lot of expectation falls on the project developer, on the property developer. Just quick about James. James is project director in the development and construction team at Greystar, with a focus. Their focus on delivering build to rent and multi-family rental communities. So I'm sure he'll tell us all about how that works. And I think it's going to be very interesting, sort of part 3 of how this all plays out. So
yes,
thank you, James.
Thanks, Lewis. Yeah, I've been sitting here listening to those two discussions and thought it's as if it's been planned, really, because although that it may not have been the most central pier of what we were doing in bringing this particular project forward, the health and well-being was very much about, from our perspective, just genuine placemaking, making places really good. For those of you who don't know Greystar, we're actually the world's largest rental housing operator, mainly in North America. We manage 425,000 homes at the moment, which have built up over the last 30 years. Been in the UK for the last 4 years. Focused initially on student housing because mainstream housing buildings didn't exist. So we've had to start from scratch, find sites, design and development, and now they're starting to come forward in our first one, not this one. One in near Canary Wharf is going to open this summer. This one is actually on site now, and we can talk about this. But this is our kind of flagship scheme because it's large and it incorporates a lot of the principles we've just been hearing about. So that's what it used to look like. It already does not look like that. The site is in Greenford, in North Ealing, and it was the site of the, excuse this side of the room, but I am going to continue on this side. The north, you can see the Grand Union Canal that weaves through the site. On the north side was the original Glaxo SmithKline headquarters. So right on this side, on the Greenford Road here, this was the original headquarters building. And then all these other buildings obviously developed over other decades. The first building was in the 1930s. That building is listed. We're keeping it and actually refurbishing it as an office. because we want people to be working in this place as well as living there. It's a mix of uses, which actually benefits the place. But the other thing, so at its peak, thousands of people worked here. Three big car park structures, which allowed for everyone to drive to work. We're not having that anymore. And then we've got obviously a canal, which strangely in the Glaxo model, there was a big high fence here, completely inaccessible, completely ignored by the development. I always find it really strange to go there and see that it was, all the sort of gas intakes and all the sort of back of house stuff was put down by the canal, and as if it had no value to it at all. On the south side was a kind of a 24-hour bakery, as I understand it. Was Hovis Sunblest had a bakery there. That was actually demolished by the previous owner before we bought the site, and so that's actually been demolished a long time ago. Both sites have been inactive as industrial sites or workplaces for at least a decade. And round, so they've been completely fenced off. So around this site is a big metal railing which completely enclosed the thing, partly because of, I suppose, of the nature of the work they were doing at Glaxo, but it created a massive obstacle in the middle of that Greenford community, which we wanted to do something about. So just if you don't know where Greenford is, it's a little map here. So that's our site in red. Greenford tube station there is, which is on the central line primarily, but also has a spur that goes currently into Paddington, but it's going to join up at West Ealing with Crossrail. And the other side, a little bit further away, is Sudbury Hill on the Piccadilly line, but also Sudbury Hill Harrow, which comes into Marylebone. So pretty well connected in terms of that. You've also obviously got the canal, and dare I say it, it's quite near the A40 in the road system. So this is the master plan that we've developed for the site. And as you see, it's a large area. The red line area there is about just over 20 acres altogether. And before we bought the site 2 years ago, the later Glaxo headquarters building had been let out to Ferrero UK. Always nice to visit them because they've got a bowl of chocolates on the desk. And then this is a management college up in this corner. So those were sort of existing tenants using those buildings. But again, we think that's a really good thing. That's people already on the site creating some activity. And those people who work there will either want somewhere to live right next to it, or will actually use some of the commercial uses that we've got in the building. So building up this master plan, here we've got 7 residential buildings. I say we're a rental operator. Even we thought that doing it all for rent would be a bit too much, because there's about 2,000 homes here altogether. Interesting enough, the previous landowner did get a residential consent, but only for sort of 600 fairly sort of conventional type of housing. I'm not sure they ever intended to build it, but that's what they got, and we've increased that to 2,000, but hopefully in a pretty sensitive way. Our 4 main rental buildings are these sort of E-shaped ones, and I'll go into the reason they're E-shaped in a little bit. We've got a dedicated affordable discount market rent building up there, which we're hoping to do a deal with Broadway Living, who are Ealing's housing company. And we've got 2 buildings at the south end of the site, which are intended for more conventional apartment sale, just to keep the tenure mixed up. And then, yes, we've got the listed building here, which we're going to refurbish as an office. So those are the principal buildings. Add on to that, the great landscaping, the central square. Get another view of that in a minute. A new pedestrian bridge across the canal, which has taken quite a lot of negotiation with Canal and River Trust, but that will provide a better route, pedestrian route through the site, across the canal, and towards the tube station, which is down here, which we think most people will use. So even if you're living in the surrounding housing here, it'll provide a much nicer route. And actually, funny enough, at the public consultation, we were asked, it's funny how the sort of psychological barrier of the existing site is there, with the railings and things. People said, oh, is it going to be a gated community? I said, absolutely not. We want to open this whole place up. you mean we'll actually be able to walk through it? Yes, you can. And so I think people who are not even going to live here are really excited about the fact that they can do that. And then finally, this road, which was closed off to the public for, back in the 80s, I think, by Glaxo, it's going to be reopened. But again, through public consultation, it's not going to be just a two-way road. We've thought very carefully about it. That this section will be, you can drive all the way through from this side, but this side you can only get through here to the access road into the development, which is very limited. It's a pedestrian-friendly zone here, certainly, and you won't be able to drive all the way through there because there was a concern that people would use this as a rat run, and that was one of the concerns from local residents that we took on board at consultation stage. Add to that a new primary school in this corner, and most relevantly for this discussion is the new health centre. We've committed to provide space for what I think is sort of a conglomeration of several small local GPs into one sort of modern health centre for the area, and we're providing the space for that in the ground floor of that ground floor and basement of that building. So, and then finally add to that the commercial and other mixed uses. So we've got a mixture of shops, cafes, restaurants, and things to activate our ground level street frontage of all of those buildings, and provide things for people, both the new residents, the new people who are working there, but also local residents as well. Because actually, one of the feedback we had, there's quite a nice pub this side here, which is a nice beer garden by the canal, which is I can recommend. But we were talking to the people in there and said, where do you go to buy do your food shopping? And most of them would get in a car, go to the big supermarket a few miles away, and come back again. And you think, well, actually, if we provide a sort of local type supermarket as part of our scheme, that may prevent some of that being necessary, which is all good. Yes, and then, sorry, there's a few facts and figures there on the right-hand side, which I won't read through, but you can do that at your leisure. So these are hot off the press. You are among the first people outside the project team to see these new images, which we've just had done of the CGIs, of what the place will look like. Very different from the surrounding housing, which is all fairly low-level suburban streets. But again, it's kind of responding in advance, if you like, to some of the principles set out in the New London Plan about good growth, higher densities, but in a really well-designed, well-managed way around near to transport nodes, and promoting some of the other things. Here's some other views. So this is the central square. There's the new bridge across the canal. And we're hoping this central square will be able to have some sort of street markets and that sort of thing, and occasional events. I think we've got I think the CGI shows a little a sort of mobile library or bookshop or something coming on. But there's various uses which are being used by the canal, which we can tap into and promote and host. And there's a couple of sort of more street level views on the right-hand side there of what we hope this will look like. It's a bit of terminology, I think, because people talk about the PRS and build to rent and what does it all mean. It's all part of the private rented sector because it is private rented, but that includes some pretty lousy properties with some pretty poor management, and that's kind of what we're trying to avoid. So we want to get away from this point. So the build to rent has been defined as something that has minimum standards of both of those things. And we see ourselves up as through that 30 years of experience of managing these sort of communities overseas. We put that sort of resident experience right at the heart of our design when we're starting out with coming up with ideas for these type of communities, and that means that the resident experience will be really, really good, as well as being a high quality accommodation, and that's kind of reflected in the build-to-rent elements of the Mayor's policy. This was the SPG that was out in last August. And of course, there's the new draft London Plan, which sort of follows on from that, although we will be making a few comments before the consultation ends next week to improve it even further. And I think, so here are some of the sort of principles for design and placemaking. Now, this is our sort of checklist for how we go about this and other schemes. And again, I won't read through them all because I know we're up against some time. But interestingly to compare Gavin's diagram, which I was just looking at on my phone quickly while he was talking, because I thought, wow, we kind of do that. And we had a similar experience when we looked back at the Egan report from around 20 years ago or so, when we found this diagram about placemaking, and we thought, just through that good design, because we're not just building something, selling it, and then moving away to our next site, and then leaving people with whatever we've created. We are there. We've got management teams in each of these rental buildings. We kind of describe it. We are there to join the community rather than impose on it, and that's quite a powerful difference actually when people think about it. But actually, all of the principles in that placemaking wheel there, we kind of cover in our design and proposals, and probably the only one we can't really do a lot about is that transport and connectivity, but we have worked with TfL obviously on the proposals for this scheme. Emerging policy on this, I'm conscious the time's slipping away, so there are differences between this and for sale housing, which I won't labour at this point, but we can do in Q&A if you really want to know about it. Look at that E-shaped building, and just the reason that it is because it's a managed building. There's a management team going to be on site there. It means we don't have to have separate cores with just a few units per floor. We can have it kind of more like a hotel-style arrangement, which is better for our sort of efficient maintenance and cleaning and that sort of thing. But what it means is for the people living there, they can get from any apartment in that building to any other part of the building, either to visit a friend or go up to the amenity space. We've got a gym and resident lounge and things right at the top level, which is accessible to everybody, regardless of which apartment you're in. And you've got the courtyard gardens at the first floor level there. You can get there without having to go down in one core across and then back up in a different core, which would be unfair apart from anything else. So in this will be our first building, which will be starting on site hopefully later this summer. It's just under 400 units. It's got a lot of retail space at ground floor as well. It's got some car parking spaces. I think it's a 1-to-3 ratio for the apartments themselves, and there's a few extra for visitors for the retail and commercial elements. But more than twice as many cycle parking spaces. There's about 3,500 of them across the entire site altogether. I think we feel that the parking is going to be kind of probably, we hope, over-provided, and that some of it will be absorbed. Some of car use will actually be absorbed by a car club rather than individual car ownership for people who just need to use one occasionally for trips. But again, it was interesting at the public consultation, the feedback people were very worried about. Well, they seem to be simultaneously worried about you're not providing enough parking because some of the houses around here have 4 cars, and therefore you need 8,000 spaces, and we ended up with 800. But the same people were still arguing about, still saying, but we're worried about the increase in traffic. So you think, well, you can't be worried about both of those things simultaneously. You need to choose which one. So we've gone for lower parking because we're in a good public transport area. And of course, that canal you can cycle along all the way through to Paddington and beyond, which I imagine will be a very pleasant thing to do. I haven't done it myself yet, but one of these days I plan to. Just a very quick final word about affordable housing, because the affordable housing in this development, this is a sort of conventional thing where we've got, affordable housing is provided under a Section 106 agreement. Housing for sale subsidises effectively the affordable housing, but there is a big gulf between them, and there's quite a lot of people who fall in that middle. They're not eligible for the affordable, they can't afford the for sale. No one's actually providing anything for them at the moment, and we think that's wrong. I think what this type of model does in the rent, yes, you've still got an affordability spectrum. You've got a slightly different form of affordable housing at the bottom, which is a discount market rent model, but in line with the mayor's principles. But actually that gap in the middle is far more of a spectrum, so that people can attain or access this housing far more readily than we feel a lot of conventional developments. So finally, I think around sort of coming back to health and well-being, I think it's about that mix of uses. It's about people perhaps using those residence lounges to work from home rather than sitting at their kitchen table in their apartment. It's providing different spaces where people can mix and become a better community, and people might even work and live on the same place. But actually, this was something by John Bird, who founded Big Issue, and I think this is a great phrase about sociable housing, rather than this sort of polarized, us and them model that's developed over the last few decades. I think what we are trying to do is really integrate everything and be a real sociable and sustainable community. I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Could I invite our three speakers to sit up here? We're quite tight for time, so I'm going to open the floor to any of you who want to ask a question rather than imposing my own questions straight away. I have some, but anybody got a question burning question they want to put up there?
Good morning, everyone. I have a question especially for Amber. In one of your recommendations, the intelligence part, you specifically said, let's tap into the local knowledge. And I'm wondering, how would you be able to map that local knowledge in a more granular level, either on GP kind of incidences of diseases or mental health issues in a more granular levels that you could then inform your project at a future stage, or even go into the healthy city streets department? How can you prioritize the refurbishment of existing streets into that healthy streets approach? And which kind of hot topics or hot areas would be recommended to be intervened first? Either schools or either hotspots of traffic incidents that could try to research. So it's a bit of how could you map that information so you could see where you could start first on both sides. Thank you.
I think you've brought out the theme of complexity quite well in that question, because as you're saying, it's this kind of weighing up of different aspects, and I guess with the Healthy Streets approach, the different arrows that point to the different parts. In terms of how we actually map that data, there's a lot of really interesting data sources that exist already. And as part of my role within my team, I help developers understand that data and bring it all together for them. I think there is more that we can do to be more sophisticated. And we have a GIS team at Turley, which we pride ourselves on using quite a lot within our work, because I think that the spatial aspect of how these problems manifest within the city is really important. I think, we need to embrace that aspect of the work a bit more and challenge ourselves to see what data we can actually map intelligently.
Yeah, I would say two things. The first is we need new data sources. I mean, this is one of the perfect data sources available for looking at how to prioritise investment in footways, for example. And the second thing I would say is we've been asked by developers how we're going to prioritise which bits of the pedestrian network to invest in. And we don't have a good answer. So longer term, I'm hoping to get access to new data sets, and with we're working with Telefonica to take some Bluetooth data from people's mobile phones, and it's about making a shift to big data, the sort of data held by Citymapper, Fitbit, Strava. So we need to tech up as planners, otherwise we're going to get left behind the rest of the world.
Is somebody doing that? Is there another city that has the model that really is locking into the data well?
I have no idea. Oh. I focus on London, and yeah, I don't know the answer. Sorry.
James, do you know with your US colleagues, do they encounter planners who are more teched up?
Personally, I don't know, but it would be nice to think that some methodology has developed over the last few decades around that.
Yeah. Was there a question over here? Did somebody put a hand up? Yeah, that's one, the two. Do you want to start here and then we move on? Oh. I was about to say that. Start there and then move back.
Hello. So this is you've obviously shown some amazing examples of some bigger schemes and the bigger aspiration. But what happens? I mean, I'm a landscape architect, and most of my bread and butter are very much small schemes that have an impact. How are you going to encourage those small-scale developments, refurbishments of blocks or whatever, to actually integrate in the way that you're suggesting to the wider urban realm, and not be just sort of passed through with very weak conditions that don't enforce a kind of the right connectivities and things?
Could we give it to the developer?
Yes, I mean, it's fair to say not all of our schemes are like this. I mean, this is a great, unique opportunity to do something on this sort of scale, and actually, although it's kind of our first major development of our own in the UK, it's actually the largest development that Greystar has ever taken on anywhere, and it just because of the nature of that site enables it. So most of our developments are probably sort of single building, where you have less impact, or you have less opportunity to create new streets of your own, and the ones we're creating here are as pedestrian based as they can be. But I think we always, we tend to site them near public transport, and naturally we would want that, the accessibility from our building to the public transport node to be as good as possible. So we would always look at very carefully at the ground floor landscaping around that, and it's partly just about all of our developments, we want to be sort of a successful place that people want to live, come to work, come to visit. And not just on day one when we put it up for sale. It's actually because we're going to be there for decades to come, looking after it. We need it to work for decades and decades. So that So we're very collaborative in that sense.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's a really interesting question of scale, because I think this is where local authorities can take a really proactive role in, and the GLA, in establishing really important guidance that can be followed, that's appropriate for small schemes as well as large schemes. Because developers that are just refurbishing a block, they need tailored guidance that will help them in that particular scenario, as well as thinking more creatively about the large sites. So I think that guidance will help if lots of small actions come together. We need that kind of strategic oversight about what works in different smaller locations.
Yeah, and we're pretty reliant on the local authorities in that regard. Obviously, they manage most of the street network as the highway authority, and it's difficult for us to help you if you've got a sharky client, and that's not focused as much on urban design, that's more focused on the bottom line. But we do think that scale's critically important. We see that somewhat hierarchically. We don't want you to see cars when you exit the building. We want you to see an attractive environment that meets our Healthy Streets indicators. And then more broadly, we're working on promoting healthy streets to your respective sectors and to the local authorities to try and create a culture of better landscaping, pretty much. And so, yeah. Good luck.
Next question here, and then.
Hi, I know I raised my hand when you said you didn't want to talk about parking, but it sort of obsesses me because of the amount of real estate cars take up in our cities. And we gave up our car 8 years ago, and there's kind of no looking back for me, and I sort of think, why are people more enlightened. So it's just interesting to know what research TfL is doing about social attitudes to car ownership. And, you know, it's a practical tool, but it's also a sort of status symbol. And there's a part of our government economy that really wants to support and promote the auto industry. Yeah. So it's a conflicting issue, but you're looking ahead to a new generation that might have different attitudes about car ownership.
So there's a few tensions linked to it. And if you look at where we want to locate growth spatially now, it's in some parts of London which have worse public transport. So one of the key changes in parking policy is that we're going to start treating PTAL4s as potentially walkable and cyclable environments pretty much. And we're very engaged in that conversation with developers, which was touched on, about whether the car park is underused. And there's a tension between us and central government, because central government would probably love it if you bought a car to prop up the UK car industry, and then we would love it if you put it in your parking space and it was never used. And then developers would love it if they get to say on day one of the sales campaign, you can have a parking space, because they feel it adds value to their development. And we're using, you know, rates of car travel as the evidence base for reducing our parking standards. And we're seeing car travel constantly decline. We're seeing less young people in London get driving licenses. So it's difficult for me to respond to the other stuff, because the moment we step outside our narrower evidence base, we've sort of gone off brief, and we want to stick to those bits of evidence that support our argument, which are you don't need a car due to the excellent public transport network we offer you, and we strongly discourage you from owning one. So you can expect larger developments with less car parking. And when developers say that the car parking space is going to be empty, our first choice is don't build it then, because it's an inefficient use of land. Finally, there's a new policy in the London plan on efficient use of land, which we do plan to use in relation to car parking as well.
Next question was there. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, good morning. I think first of all, as a resident of Greenford neighbourhood, I was really glad to see the photos, very convincing. But as an architect and someone who works in urban design, I shall remain sceptical until we see how it actually performs.
Quite right.
That is your prerogative, yes.
And I think my question also relates to the same things as, because I spent quite a lot of time reading through and also tried to implement some of the policies within designs, and I looked into London Health, urban developments, and NHS, the healthy sort of street that you also mentioned, or London Plan, which is quite a massive document. But to my surprise, there was a very limited attention or sort of factors related to urban morphologies and how that actually affect on creating sort of undesirable microclimate within the spaces. Because I would imagine ultimately this is what we are trying to do. That's why I said we should see how it performs, because you might create a, as you said, placemaking. You might create a very functional and practical space, but in reality it might not function as we see it on CGI because of those undesirable microclimates. So I just want to know, what is your sort of take on that?
Well, perhaps I'll go first. I mean, there's a huge amount of work that's gone into that environmental impact assessment at the time of the application, which has looked at all. It's put models in wind tunnels. It's looked at sunlight and daylight and all those sort of issues. So we believe that, yes, and we put a lot of work into that landscaping. So rather than putting spindly little shoots, we're actually putting in semi-mature trees, to make the place good from day one, rather than in 10 or 20 years' time, perhaps, with a following wind. So, and something I forgot to mention is actually we're right across the road from us is Horsenden Hill, which is an enormous sort of and pretty underused sort of public park area, which actually, someone tells me is about the same size as Hyde Park, but which is an incredible resource, and we're actually improving access to that as well. So Yeah, I think we've done everything we can do at this stage before we actually construct it. But
you did all these not because of the policies created by, let's say, what we heard from the two first in the presentation.
I think it's a cracking question because I think it's a good example of where multidisciplinary collaboration is lacking. I don't think there's a good connection between air quality modelling and transport modelling, for example, at the moment. And I think that multidisciplinary collaboration is going to have to increase. And I quite like the EIA approach where it zooms out and looks at a wider range of factors, sort of sustainability factors in relation to development. But at the moment, the policies and how they're implemented by planners and how the obligations are felt by developers and designers are very compartmentalised. So, and we're looking into that, and it's possibly something for the next mayoral term, because at the moment we have to just launch this agenda. But it's I think it's a very accurate statement, and it's a really good point.
Just picking up on the environmental impact assessment regulation change, I think the inclusion of human health within EIA, I think some consultants and developers almost been a bit sort of taken aback by this inclusion now. But I think this is a really good chapter that can be included in EIA, which is multidisciplinary. And when we do that assessment, I speak to the air quality consultant, I speak to the noise consultant, and we make sure that that comes together within that chapter. But what we're seeing is that human health often can be just tagged on at the end of all the different chapters or included in the socioeconomic chapter. So I think there's a bit of almost needs to be quite courageous in terms of what we can actually achieve within that document, and be bold about making those links between the experts that exist within the team already.
Yeah, and it relies on dialogue between all of you guys, because the last thing we want to do is create another separate exercise, which is in addition to all the onerous existing exercises. So, but yeah, it's a very good question.
I'm going to take these two questions and then we have to wrap up, I think. So, two here. One.
Elizabeth Crawford, Cartwright Pickard Architects. The health and wellbeing agenda is obviously quite a wide issue, and it seems that it needs to be joined up, as you've just been saying. And following on from other questions about implementation and policy, some of the forward-thinking developers have already started using a lot of what's captured in the Healthy Streets. As Greystar thinking of doing any post-occupancy evaluation on those key issues so that it can be documented and then used as further?
Yeah, not been formally suggested, I don't think, but I'm sure we'd be very willing to do that, because, as you say, we're about creating long-term places, so the more we can demonstrate that we've actually done that, the better for everyone, really. So.
And this comes back to the sort of third recommendation that I put forward about impact. And I think having that intelligence and that research that we can draw on to say, you know, in this particular site, it was a small complex in a London city site, and we're able to change these aspects of the scheme, and this is the result. I think that would be really powerful going forward.
We'll take that on board to produce more case studies, pretty much. Yeah.
Hello, Joyce Chen from HOK Architects. I actually have a similar questions about post-occupancy evaluation, since it has been asked. I just want to understand what's your thoughts about measuring happiness, well-being. I mean, obviously it's an interconnected topic, but as developer and, you know, transportation provider or consultant, how do you actually create a pathway to understand, you know, the benefits of good design?
Okay, well, I can go first and duck that. I don't do that, and I don't plan to do that. I measure increased walking and cycling on the assumption that extends your lifespan and reduces your chances of cancer. And that's what I'll be sticking to for a couple of decades, you know, because it's been such a relief to have that new emphasis come into my professional life. It makes me feel good, like I'm helping people. So, you know, the psychological stuff, I hope will just flow from your increased physical activity. Yeah, and I'll pass that on.
Yeah. I'll just talk about my experience of sort of the academic research that I've been in touch with. But this debate is hot in terms of we're now thinking beyond measurements such as GDP, and there's so many indexes that we could use to now measure happiness, health, Human Development Index being probably one of the most famous ones. So I think we just have to remain reflective about what scale we're trying to measure at. And I think if backing the Healthy Streets approach and the checklist that we can use, I think is really important. Whereas some of the other debates are more happening at national level in terms of the Human Development Index as being a challenge to GDP.
I would just, I think what we are trying to do with a scheme like Greenford is recognising that actually people's lives and patterns and career patterns and all sorts of things are changing, and therefore people need to have a bit of flexibility but also interconnectivity with other people. So I think this way of living may not suit everybody, it may not suit everyone for their entire life, but for parts of their life it certainly will suit a lot of people. And I suppose the idea of coming into a managed building where you don't, it's a fairly easy process to come in, and then if there's a problem with the washing machine or something, it will just get fixed straight away. So it's about reducing stress levels on that sort of simple domestic level, but also through those shared resident amenities, whether it's the gym or the lounge or the shared roof terraces and that sort of, people will naturally get to know each other without being forced into it. And that's the business driver for that. For us, is that if people have friends in the building, we think they'll be likely to live there for a longer time, and renew leases and want to be there for a longer time, and that will create a happier community as a result.
Well, thank you very much for a great last question. That was a really good sort of bringing things together, and I'd like to thank our three speakers for super presentations and honest answering, I think. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming, and just a final reminder, the final session of the Wellbeing series of talks, although we'll return to the topic many times, it's next week, the Storstrom Prison thing. It's going to be a really lovely presentation, fascinating topic. So I hope to see you there, and thank you.